While our mother's mother, Ori, was never a part of our lives growing up, her grandmother, Carrie, was a different story. She was never farther than a letter or a phone call away. I remember going to her house in Yakima at least twice after we had moved to British Columbia, Canada, when I was 4. I remember her little white house with red trim and a sidewalk. At the door was a cement block with a couple of stairs instead of a front porch, and I remember it as painted red. I had a pair of hard-heeled shoes that made a clackety sound as I walked on the sidewalk, and I was enthralled by the sound and walked up and down tirelessly just to hear it. Clickety, clickety, clickety. A sidewalk was a pretty incredible novelty for a little girl who'd never lived anywhere but on a farm, and my Grandma Kelly had one that went right to her front door. Behind the front door was a cramped little space with a cluttered counter between the living room and kitchen. She had 2 little Karen Terriers living inside the house, also a novelty for me. She talked to them like they were her children and kept a stash of Milky Way candy bars under the counter for a daily routine that involved cutting one in half, eating it herself, and dividing the second half for each of the dogs. I guess that was before anyone knew what chocolate did to dogs. The high point of any day for myself and my little brother Twist was when those candy bars were on the counter, because she would divide the treat 5 ways so we could each have a piece as well. Both Carrie and Kelly suffered from diabetes, and by the time of our first visit, Kelly had lost a leg to the dreaded curse. The second time we visited, he had lost his other leg. He still had thighs, but nothing below the knee. That also was pretty intriguing to 2 little kids. The thing about Grandma Kelly was that she always seemed happy, even when she was talking about Kelly having no leg. When our family moved from Canada to Oregon after Kelly died, Carrie would visit frequently, maybe every year or so. My mother loved her visits, as did we. As children, we were not deep thinking her visits or the effect they had on our mother, but we always looked forward to them. She was our grandma and she paid attention to us. We hadn't the slightest notion of what her life was before us. We could have cared less. We knew she liked to sing, and she did sing around the house, as did my mother, though their voices were very different. Carrie's voice was deep and husky, while my mother's was silky and crisp and full of expression. Once while visiting us, she had shared with me how she envied her granddaughter's immense talent, claiming that while she and Ori had both been professional singers, neither of them were as talented as my mother. This was the same visit that she talked about the beef trust and how much she missed it, and how she'd been acquainted with Ed Sullivan and Mickey Rooney. She talked about how she was watching the Ed Sullivan show one day on TV when Ed started talking about the old days and wondering whatever happened to some of his old favorite performers, including the Big Four of the Beef Trust. Now, I adored Mickey Rooney, but even with her name dropping, it never occurred to me that she had once been part of something that was a pretty big deal, known as Billy Watson's Beef Trust. They were even famous across the pond. It turns out that Carrie was kind of a 1930s overweight burlesque rock star, but in the 1960s, she was just my grandma who sent money in Christmas and brought joy when she came to visit. My grandpa Freiner visited a little less often than Carrie did, as it was a mighty long drive from St. Louis. But what a joy it was when he did come. He prayed and read his Bible twice a day, not including every meal. He was light-hearted and full of fun and always wore that wide grin. I can still see that grin on my own son's face today. He and his wife Myrtle brought love and light into our house with a rare dose of pleasure for my mother. I'm Paddy McGee, from Ballina, he's a in an elegant ship, I come over the sea. My German grandpa would happily sing the songs of Paddy McGee and take us sightseeing. He was nothing but fun. I was probably only 13 on one such visit when he began to talk about Ori in a way that made it clear that she was his daughter. What? At first I was shocked that he even knew Grandma Kenster, but the idea that she was his daughter? No way! I just couldn't get my head around that notion, as I had never given an ounce of thought over how they all were connected. The real stunner was that if Carrie was Ori's mother, which I knew to be true, and Grandpa Freiner was her father, then my Grandma Kelly and my Grandpa Freiner had known each other in the biblical sense, and that just didn't seem to be possibly true. It took a long time for me to reconcile that, and I didn't want to ask my mother. Back then, people did not discuss those matters with kids. It just seemed impossible. I happened to stumble across a document, the application for a marriage license for a young Ed and Carrie. I can just imagine them walking into the courthouse. It probably went something like this. March 21st, 1914. Carolina Petchenik, the first of 4 children born to Adolf and Margaret Petchenik of St. Louis, Missouri, just 2 months short of her 16th birthday, was hopelessly in love with 19-year-old Edward Warren Freiner, son of Philip and Julia Freiner. Ed happened to feel the same way about Carrie as she did about him. It was a brisk Saturday morning, end of winter, when Ed harnessed the horse to the cart to go pick up Carrie. Now, taking the horse and carriage out, that would have probably required parental permission from both sets of parents. So there's one thing that's fairly certain, that to obtain the permission, that would have involved maybe telling some things that were a little short of the truth. The truth was that they were on their way to the Charles County Courthouse to obtain a marriage license. It was just a little too far to walk, so the untruth was necessary. Upon reaching the courthouse, Ed tied the horse to a rail in a shaded spot on the grounds nearby, and together he and Carrie approached the magnificent structure, hand in hand and somewhat in awe. They were even more in awe once inside under the spectacular dome and almost past the door that was labeled Licenses. City Clerk. They gave one another a reassuring look before exhaling and going inside.
Can I help you?
The gentleman at the window asked. Ed took charge, trying to sound older.
Hi, I'm Ed Freiner and, this is my fiancée Carrie. We wish to wed and will need a marriage license.
Do you have your parents' permission?
The man inquired. Ed and Carrie looked at each other with a nervous smile. Carrie batted her eyes at the man and offered him a confident smile.
Oh, my goodness. I turned 18 last July, and Ed, well, he turned 21 in December. We are most definitely of age, and our parents are looking forward to a wedding.
The man paused a moment before retrieving 2 pieces of paper from a drawer under the counter, which he slapped down in front of each of them.
Fill these out,
he said. Ed and Carrie each filled out their portion of the application, which required them to verify by their signature that they were of age. The clerk squinted his eyes at them for a few seconds as they handed back the signed applications.
That'll be $2, please.
Ed reached in his pocket and gave the man $2. It is my guess that of the 2 of them, Carrie was the more accomplished liar. 2 months later, World War I began in Europe, and 1 year later to the day, little Aurora Ann Freiner was born, and Carrie and Ed were parents. Things would change. In 1917, Ed would register for the draft. In the early part of 1918, Ed would enlist in the Navy, leaving his teenage wife and child at home until he was discharged in 1921. His enlistment came just 1 year after the death of his father, Philip Freiner. Carrie had always been close to her baby brother, Raymond. He made an ideal playmate for little Ori. Unfortunately, tragedy struck again the year that Ed was discharged from the Navy, when Carrie's mother, Margaret Martin Petchenik, died, leaving her little brother Raymond, just 10 years old, motherless. Of course she took care of him, and he and Ori were like sister and brother. Carrie would be waiting for Ed when he got home, but by 1930 she and Ori would be living with a man she was married to named Nicholas Wistenberg in Chicago, Illinois. I'm not sure what ended the teenage marriage of Carrie and Ed. We'll probably never know for sure. My brother Twist recalls overhearing a discussion between my mother and our Grandpa Freiner, where he expressed regrets over not fighting harder for his daughter Ori.
He loved his wife, Myrtle, and she was lovely, and they were meant to be. And maybe he and Carrie were not. When I knew them, I would have to characterize them as very different people from one another.
Both the Freiners and the Petcheniks were third-generation German immigrants. The story of St. Louis is integral to the story of these families. Just about the time that Lewis and Clark were loading the Corps of Discovery into the waters of the Big Muddy at what is now Charles, Missouri, masses of German peoples were finding the circumstances in their homeland intolerable. Farmers were having their land seized, cities were overcrowded with poor and hungry people, and religious persecution was rampant. These disenfranchised Germans began to trickle into the frontier edges of the new America in the 1820s, and by the early 1830s, whole German cities were being abandoned in search of a better life, and intact German communities were springing up overnight throughout America. In 1833, two men from the town of Gießen, Germany, dreaming of reinstating in America the unrealized vision they'd once held for their beloved homeland, formed the Gießen Immigration Society. They had hoped to create their own little democratic German state so that they would never again have to answer to ruthless aristocrats who had for so long commanded their lives. They had heard that St. Louis, Missouri had become the gateway to a new world, and this seemed like the perfect place to settle. By 1834, the Gießen Immigration Society had convinced 500 of their neighbors to purchase passage and set sail for America. Not all of them survived the voyage, but the survivors, upon setting foot on American soil, headed west towards the mighty Mississippi River until they found the place within the St. Louis cities that reminded them of home. The settlement became known as the Missouri Rhineland, and by 1937, 7,000 Germans were living in and around St. Louis. There was another group of immigrants that settled in the Missouri Rhineland, the Irish. They also loved the singing and the dancing and the beer. And you know what they brought with them? The songs of Patty McGee. Of course, the idea of a German state in America was not to be, and as the Rhinelanders began slowly melting into the new Western culture, as they also clung to their German roots and identity, with a combination of traditional farming, politics that embraced the rights of the common man, and plenty of traditional festivals. While nice Southern families were sipping their mint tea, conversing graciously in soft tones, and going to church on Sunday, the atmosphere in the Missouri Rhineland was often a bit more lively, with loud music, robust beer drinking, and energetic dancing. They would ultimately learn to blend in, but they would never be able to forget the conditions that had brought them there, which made it difficult to reconcile the acceptance of slavery among other Missouri farmers. They loved their newfound freedom and wanted it for everyone. By the early 1900s, St. Louis was one of the liveliest cities in the country. It was the host of both the Summer Olympics and the World's Fair in 1904. It was rich in cultural diversity and a fertile ground for the burgeoning jazz age.
I have very few photographs of my grandpa Ed Freiner's family, but the ones I have tell a story. A 1910 census shows Ed's family, Philip and Julia Freiner, and their four sons, Ed, George, Fred, and Earl. Here you can see a photograph of Ed's younger brother, Earl. This blurry family photograph has a notation on the back. Aunt Ann took this. Reading from left to right, your granddad's leg and hand. Well, I'm assuming that this was written to my mother because it's her granddad's leg and hand. Aunt Ann Gold, Uncle Ozro's wife, Uncle Ozro, Steve and something brother, Uncle Earl, and Aunt Lizzie Fremer. Aunt Lizzie would be Julia Gold's sister, Tilly Elizabeth Fremer. Here we have her sister Daisy. Here we have her sister Flora Richardson with her family. Here we have another family photo with a notation. The group: Aunt Ann Freiner, Grandma Scott, Bob Davis, Marilyn's husband, Marilyn, Uncle Earl Freiner, Uncle Ozro Gold, Aunt Lizzie Femer, Aunt Ann Gold, and the other two. Grandma Scott? What on earth could my mother's Grandma Scott possibly be doing with a bunch of Freiners? Looking quite happy, I must add. She looks like she belongs. Another one. This one's labeled Grandma Scott's 79th birthday. And look, there's Aunt Lizzie and Marilyn Davis. Well, that got me thinking, if Grandma Scott was so chummy with the Freiners, well, that just might explain how Ori from St. Louis, Missouri met Scotty from Little Rock, Arkansas. Then I remembered that Grandma Scott didn't even make it to her 69th birthday. This was so confusing.
This became one of my very favorite photographs when I finally understood who that lady was in this photograph with me and my mother and my little brother Twist, my great-great-grandmother, Julia Gold Freiner. One day it just hit me. Doesn't she look an awfully lot like the Grandma Scott celebrating her 79th birthday with Marilyn Davis and Aunt Lizzie? A little more digging revealed that there were actually two Grandma Scotts. One was my mother's Grandma Scott, Pearl, and the other? Ori had a Grandma Scott, too. In 1918, after the death of her husband Philip, Julia Goldfreiner had remarried. And what was that man's name? Miranda Charles Scott. Ori was only a couple of years old, and so she never knew Julia as anyone but Grandma Scott. As for Marilyn Davis, well, it turns out that she is Ed's brother Earl's daughter. I've had a lot of difficulty trying to get the goods on Miranda Charles Scott, but if it were to turn out that there was a connection between him and the Scotts of Arkansas, well, that would pretty much give us a good idea how Scotty met Ori.